The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Life and Works of Mark Twain. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, popularly known as Mark Twain, used this pen name drawn from the depth of the great Mississippi River. He was born on 30th November 1835 in Florida, Missouri, and later brought up in Hannibal. After his father's death in 1847, he was apprenticed to a printer and then he wrote for his brother's newspaper. From 1857 to 1861, he was a river pilot on the Mississippi River. It must be said that his stint on the river furnished the background and the locale of his most famous books. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are his river books. During the Civil War, he worked as a newspaper correspondent for various magazines, adopting the pseudonym Mark Twain. Under this name, he published his first successful story, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, in 1865. His most famous works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and its sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, are deeply rooted in his own childhood. The novels paint an unforgettable picture of Mississippi frontier life. Life on the Mississippi is an autobiographical account of his life as a river pilot. He spent his final decade dictating his autobiography, which appeared in 1924. Clemens died on 21st April 1910. A legendary figure in American literature, the world remembers him as a novelist, a humorist, and as an innovator who freed language from the shackles of convention. The novel Huckleberry Finn proves this. Characters in the novel. Huck Finn is the hero. He is a picaro and narrator of the novel. He is an illegitimate child abused and kidnapped by his drunken father. It is through Huck that readers see other characters and events of the novel. Throughout the book, Huck journeys down the Mississippi River with Jim. Jim is Miss Watson's slave. He becomes Huck's best friend. Tom Sawyer is Huck's best boyhood friend and foil. He freely spins lies. He wants things to be exactly as they are in the adventure books he reads. Widow Douglas adopts Huck Finn and tries to civilize him. Miss Watson is the sister of Widow Douglas and owner of Jim. Pap Finn is Huck's drunken father. Judge Thatcher takes charge of Huck's money to keep Pap from stealing it from him. Shepherd's sons, the family is in feud with the Grangerfords. They fight the Grangerfords and are responsible for killing Buck, Buck's father, and his two brothers. Harney is one of Shepherd's son boys. He runs away with one of Grangerford girls, Miss Sophie, leading to a bloodbath. The Grangerfords are in feud with the Shepherdson family. They take in Huck when his raft crashes near their home. They feed and clothe him. Sophia is the most beautiful of the Grangerford daughters. She is in love with Harney Shepherdson. Buck is the smallest son of the Grangerford family. Huck becomes good friends with Buck. Emmeline is the Grangerford's dead daughter. Judith Loftus is a minor character who catches Huck when he dresses as a girl. The king is the older of the two conmen who takes refuge on the raft that Jim and Huck take. He insists that he must be treated like a king and very effectively makes slaves of both Huck and Jim. He pretends to be Peter Wilkes' brother. The duke is younger than the king. He convinces Huck and Jim that he is a duke and he must deserve royal treatment. He is more crafty, scheming, and educated than the king. He pretends to be the deaf and dumb brother of Peter Wilkes. Colonel Sherburne is a well-dressed 55-year-old man. He is articulate and respected member of the town into which Boggs gallop, and he shoots Boggs for yelling like a lunatic in the streets. Boggs is a drunken, red-faced 50-year-old man. Colonel Sherburne shoots him and kills him. Peter Wilkes is the dead man who leaves his estate to his two brothers and nieces. Mary Jane is 19-year-old sweet daughter of Peter Wilkes. She is Huck's favorite girl. He admires her for her beauty, sweetness, and toughness. Susanna and Joanna, aged 15 and 14, are the younger daughters of Peter Wilkes. Harvey and William Wilkes are Peter's two brothers. Aunt Sally Fell is Tom Sawyer's aunt and Uncle Silas's wife. Jim is being kept at her house. Uncle Silas Fell is Aunt Sally's husband and Tom Sawyer's uncle. Introduction to the novel. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is considered Mark Twain's masterpiece. All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Ernest Hemingway famously declared in 1935, and he adds, "It's the best book we have had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, there has been nothing as good since." Again, according to Bernard DeVoto, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn contains God's plenty. Like Canterbury Tales, it is rich in narrative power, high comedy, and biting satire. Mark Twain was not quite 50 when he published The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in February 1884. It draws the attention of the readers and asks them to re-examine the definitions of civilization and freedom, right and wrong, social responsibility and inhumanity. The novel talks about the pre-Civil War days when the controversy over slavery spoiled the image of America as a land of freedom. The novel offers an excellent example of American picaresque fiction. The word picaresque is derived from the Spanish word picaro, which means a rogue or a rascal. A picaresque novel depicts the adventures of a roguish but appealing hero, usually of low class, who lives by his wits in a corrupt society. It has episodic incidents and no organic plot. There is a lack of coherent plot structure. In Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain employs the first-person narrative style. Huck, the narrator, is not really educated and the language he uses is ungrammatical. For the first time, everyday rustic speech is used in writing an entire novel. The novel is a commentary on American race relations, class divisions, and violence, and is an examination of humanity's social responsibility in its pursuit of freedom. The plot of the novel. The novel, consisting of 43 chapters, begins where the novel The Adventures of Tom Sawyer ends, that is in St. Petersburg, Missouri, on the Mississippi River, 40 to 50 years before the novel was written. So, it's between 1834 and 1844, before the American Civil War. Tom and Huck each receives $6,000 from the treasure they found. This will be the source of many of Huck's problems. He lives now with the widow Douglas, who has taken him in as her son. Miss Watson and widow Douglas attempts to civilize Huck and teach him religion. They desire that Huck be clean, well-fed, and schooled. It got tiresome for him, and Huck escapes out of his window to join Tom Sawyer for new adventures. The boys meet Jim, Miss Watson's nigger. Money leads his father, Pap, to kidnap Huck. He takes him up the river to a shack on the Illinois side of the river. At first, Huck enjoys the return to freedom, but living with his father has its difficulties. He either leaves Huck locked up in the cabin alone or beats him up. He escapes from his father, faking his own death, and joins up with the runaway slave Jim in Jackson's Island. Together they make their way down the Mississippi on the raft. The novelist uses the picaresque device of a journey to introduce a number of events and a variety of characters. While traveling on a raft down the river, Huck and Jim have many adventures, and living this way, they get to know each other. During many long talks, they become best of friends. They find a house with a dead man. They end up stealing many things from the house. They find a wrecked ship and go on it, only to be mixed up with murderers. There, they get away with money and some other goods. Then, they get separated from each other in the heavy fog, but eventually they find each other. A steamboat crashes into their raft and Jim and Huck are separated again. Among their adventures with wrecked ships, murderers, heavy fog, slave hunters, and accidents, the two encounter cruelty, trickery, violence, and hardship along the Mississippi River. Huck also becomes a witness to the feud between the Grangerford and Shepherdson families. He and Jim are joined by two villainous conmen, the king and the duke, who use them as they go from town to town, scheming people out of their money. Huck finally gets rid of them, but is left to search for Jim, who gets sold by the king. Huck approaches each of these problems with his native wit. He ends up at the house of Aunt Sally, who is Tom's aunt. Tom reappears in time to help Huck to rescue Jim in a characteristically romantic manner. Finally, Tom reveals that Jim is in fact no longer a slave. Miss Watson died and set him free in her will. Tom gives Jim $40 for his trouble. The adventures of Huck and Jim are full of life lessons. There's hope for freedom, there is pain and loss of missed opportunities, the memories of family and friends, the cruelty they have witnessed, and the moral dilemmas they encounter. And yet, in the middle of these trials, both Huck and Jim meet with kindness among strangers. As already mentioned, Huckleberry Finn follows the picaresque tradition. It is the novel of the road with no organic unity of the plot and has many incidents of Huck's adventure loosely strung together. In this novel, the Picaro is a 13-year-old orphan who belongs to the lowest class and hates refinement, religion, and culture. He has no roots and no background or breeding. He has a good-for-nothing drunkard father who alternately abandons him and then returns to persecute him. Here, as in other picaresque novels, the purpose of the novelist is not merely to amuse the readers with humor and comedy, but also to expose the corruptions of the society through the suffering of two individuals and to improve by example. Another quality of Mark Twain is his ability to tell the real history of life by using an autobiographical atmosphere. In Huckleberry Finn 2, Twain uses his experiences of life in shaping the story. He draws his characters from real life. Characters like Huck Finn, Tom, Jim, and Pap Finn are real and drawn from Twain's own memory. Huck journeys down the river and his experiences picturized in the river valley have symbolical meaning too. The forgery of Duke and Dauphin presented in the novel is based on some events in Twain's own life. Boggs' murder by Colonel Shelburne and theatrical show of the Royal Nonsuch are real episodes which have been considered to be utilized in the framework of the novel. Huck's father, Pap Finn, is an outcast, heavy drunkard, savage, and untidy man. His prototype was Jimmy Finn, who was a village drunkard, and the character Judge Thatcher is identifiable with Twain's own father, John Marshall. Huck Finn is also drawn from a real character whose name was Tom Blankenship. Jim the slave is a representative character who is the model of Uncle Daniel, a faithful but superstitious servant. The novel has various themes related to the development of the central character Huck: moral and social conditions, freedom and slavery, criticism of the so-called civilization and an escape from it, and about human relationship. All these form some of the themes of the novel. Above all, the central theme of the novel is related to love and brutality in the social life. Bildungsroman or coming of age of Huckleberry Finn. The story traces Huck's development from boyhood into maturity. He grows from a young carefree boy into a responsible young man with a fine sense of judgment. At the outset of the book, Huck is seen in the context of the town, constricting environment of Widow Douglas, and Miss Watson stifles him. He is childish in Tom Sawyer's gang, playing tricks on others. Huck always presents himself as a subordinate to Tom Sawyer. He has a good heart but a conscience deformed by the society in which he was raised. While living with the widow Douglas, he makes all efforts to conform to her rules, but also feels that she is using her power to find fault in him. Huck and Jim's escape leads to a variety of adventures and discussions that deepen and enrich Huck's understanding and appreciation of Jim, whom he always thinks of as a nigger lower on the social scale. He discovers that Jim does have significant human feelings. It is an important realization that breaks him loose from his racist background. As the novel develops, so do Huck's notions of right and wrong. He learns that right codes of conduct, like Christianity, or the blood feuds of grandson and shepherd's son, don't necessarily lead to good results. Huck learns that he must follow the moral intuitions of his heart, which requires that he be flexible in responding to moral dilemmas. And indeed, it is by following his heart that Huck makes the right decision to help Jim escape from bondage. This mature moral decision is contrasted with the immature way in which Tom goes about. By the end of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck is morally mature and realistic. The main theme of the novel is man's inhumanity to man. As Huck says, human beings can be lawfully cruel to one another. All the major events and more of the minor ones are variations on this theme. Although Twain wrote the novel after slavery was abolished, he set it several decades earlier when slavery was still a fact of life. The callous, heartless, and calculated ill treatment of the Negroes by the Southern aristocrats illustrate the theme significantly. In Huckleberry Finn, Twain exposes the hypocrisy of slavery. He demonstrates how racism distorts the oppressors and the oppressed. The result is a world of moral confusion in which seemingly good white people such as Miss Watson and Sally Phelps express no concern about the injustice of slavery or the cruelty of separating Jim from his family. From the moment that Huck runs away from Pap and the widow, the story is organized as a quest for freedom. Huck also raises the issue of his freedom in the novel's very first page, when he says he was free and satisfied when he runs away from the widow's attempts to civilize him. Freedom for Huck, thus, is freedom from the constrictions and frustrations of genteel respectability. After Pap kidnaps him, his confinement becomes much more severe and his captivity more analogous to Jim's enslavement. Thank you and have a nice day.